The rain started just after 2 o'clock, which meant Grace would have the afternoon to herself. She could tell by the sound of it, the particular way it hit the awning above her front door, the way the street outside went from the low murmur of a Wednesday to something almost church-like in its quiet. In 8 years of running Whitmore's books alone, she had learned to read the weather the way she read first sentences, quickly, accurately, and often with a resigned kind of affection. She turned on the lamp over the reading chairs by the window. The 2 chairs had belonged to her husband. She'd never moved them, and she'd stopped asking herself why. The shop smelled like it always did in autumn aged paper, and the faint cedar of the shelves her father-in-law had built when this place was still Thomas's dream. Thomas had planned the whole store before he got sick. The layout, the handwritten staff recommendations on index cards, tucked into every display the policy of never alphabetizing literary fiction, because as he put it, people who love real books don't need a library system to find what they love. They browse, they discover, they stay. He had been dead for 8 years. She kept the policy. Grace was replacing the index cards on the new arrivals table. She rewrote them every season, finding it useful to revisit why she'd loved certain books, finding it occasionally painful when the bell above the door chimed once and a man walked in off the rain. She looked up from instinct. He was tall, mid to late 50s, she guessed, though he carried himself with a kind of deliberate ease that made age hard to pin down. Dark gray coat, plainly cut the kind that cost more than it announced. He was shaking the water from his sleeve when he stepped inside, and he glanced around the store the way people do when they've just stepped somewhere they didn't entirely expect, not quite cautious, not quite impressed, somewhere between the two. "Afternoon," Grace said. He nodded at her. "Afternoon." He didn't ask for anything, didn't pull out his phone to check a title, just began to move slowly through the nearest aisle, which happened to be 20th century American literature, and Grace went back to her index cards. She watched him the way she watched all customers who came in alone on rainy days, which was a particular kind of watching, half present, half occupied with something else. He wasn't browsing the way tourists browsed, grabbing whatever had a pretty spine. He was reading the first pages, opening, reading a paragraph, putting back. The practiced motion of someone who had done it 10,000 times and still hadn't found exactly the right thing. She knew that feeling. He was in the store for 40 minutes. He bought a collection of John Cheever short stories, a used copy of Evan S. Connell's Mrs. Bridge, and a small anthology of New England poetry she'd had in a wire basket near the register for 2 years without selling a single copy. When he brought them to the counter, she tried not to look surprised about the poetry. "Good choices," she said, which was honest, not flattery. He looked at her for a moment. "You've read all of them." "The Cheever and the Connell, yes. I read that anthology cover to cover the week it came in." She put the books in a paper bag. "Nobody ever buys it." "Then why do you keep it out?" "Because I keep hoping someone will." He paid in cash, which nobody did anymore, and tucked the bag under his arm. He was halfway to the door when he stopped. "Is that a recommendation shelf?" he said. Not quite a question, looking at the section of the wall she'd lined with handwritten cards on pale yellow paper, or more of a curated arrangement. "It's what I've been reading lately, what I think is worth the time." He studied it for a moment. "That's rarer than it sounds." Then he left and Grace listened to the rain. But he came back the next afternoon. She was in the back room cataloging a box of estate sale books when she heard the bell, and when she came out, he was already in the biography section, which was near the back and not easy to find unless you knew the layout or were willing to wander. He had the Connell tucked under his arm. Already done. "That was fast," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He said it without embarrassment. "I kept reading." She found herself pleased in the way she was pleased when a book did what it was supposed to do. "It has that effect. Did you like it?" He thought about it longer than most people would. "I found it sad in the way that good books are sad. The kind where you keep thinking you understand the character and then realize you've been charitable when you should have been honest." Grace looked at him. "That's exactly right," she said. She left him alone after that because she'd learned long ago that the best booksellers know when to step back. But she was aware of him in the way you become aware of an unusual sound in a quiet house, not alarmed, just attentive. He bought a copy of Wallace Stegner's Crossing to Safety before he left, and he paused again at the door. "You have good instincts," he said. "About the books. I've had a lot of time with them." He nodded slightly. Not agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement. He told her his name was Daniel. She told him hers was Grace. Matt. On the third day, she made coffee. It wasn't planned. She made coffee every afternoon regardless. And when she carried 2 cups out of the back room, and he was already in the reading chairs by the window, sitting with the Stegner open in his lap, it seemed simpler to offer him one than to carry both back. He accepted it without making a production of the gesture. She sat in the second chair, Thomas's chair, which she still thought of that way, even though she'd sat in it herself 3,000 times since, and they read in the same room without speaking for almost 20 minutes, and it wasn't awkward. That was the thing she noticed afterward alone in the kitchen. It hadn't been awkward. "You grew up here," he said eventually. "Married into it. I'm originally from Vermont." She turned a page. "Thomas, my husband, he grew up in Harwick. The bookstore was always his idea." A pause, not an uncomfortable one. "He passed away 8 years ago." She said it the way she always said it now, not without weight, but without the flinching that had characterized the first few years. "Cancer." He was 53. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She meant it. She always meant it, even after 8 years of hearing it. He was quiet for a moment. "And you kept the store." "Someone had to." It wasn't self-pity. She said it lightly. But he seemed to hear the layer under it because he didn't respond with the thing people usually said next, which was something along the lines of "what a beautiful tribute," or "he would have been so proud." He just nodded and looked back at his book. She liked him a little more for that. Harwick, Massachusetts was not the kind of town that drew strangers for very long. It sat in a shallow valley between low hills about an hour from the coast, small enough that the hardware store and the pharmacy and the diner occupied the same 2-block stretch, large enough to have a proper library and a decent elementary school. The population hovered around 4,500. Most people had lived there their whole lives, or had married into it, or had come for one reason and stayed for a different one, and gradually stopped examining why. Grace had been one of those. She had come for Thomas and stayed for herself for the shop, the neighbors, the particular quality of light, in the fall when the maples came in, the way her whole body relaxed on the walk to work in the morning. She had stayed because eventually Harwick had stopped feeling like Thomas's town and started feeling like hers. She didn't explain any of this to Daniel, but she told him small versions of it over the following days. The way you do with someone who listens well, by which she meant someone who doesn't immediately begin assembling their own parallel story while you're still telling yours. He listened the way she liked, with attention, with small follow-up questions, with occasional silences that meant he was thinking rather than waiting. She told him about Olivia. Her daughter, who was 30 and lived in Chicago now and worked in corporate finance, which Grace privately felt was a practical choice that had cost her daughter something, though she'd never said so directly. She told him that Olivia called on Sundays and that the calls were good, and also sometimes slightly careful in the way conversations are careful when people who love each other have had certain arguments that haven't been fully resolved. "You're close," Daniel said. It was a statement with a question underneath it, in the way that mothers and daughters are close when they're also stubborn. Grace smiled briefly. "She's wonderful. She worries about me. I find that slightly suffocating and completely understandable." He smiled. It was the most he'd smiled since he'd walked in on that first rainy afternoon, and it changed his face, made it more accessible, less carefully composed. "Do you have children?" she asked. "A son. He lives in San Francisco. We talk, but—" He stopped. "We're working on it." She didn't push. She refilled his coffee instead. He told her almost nothing about himself. She registered this without quite flagging it as suspicious. Some people were private. She was private herself in certain ways. He talked freely about books, about ideas, about the town he'd been asking, small questions about the history of Harwick, the older buildings, the families that had been here since before her time. He mentioned once that he'd been reading local history, and she'd pointed him to the library 2 blocks over where a retired schoolteacher named Edna Marsh ran a remarkably good local archive. She assumed he was retired. He had the qualities she associated with men who had been intensely busy for most of their lives, and were now learning, not always comfortably, what to do with stillness. She didn't ask what he'd retired from. He told her his name was Daniel, and that was the name she used. On the 6th day, it was a Friday, and the shop was busier than usual. A school group in the morning. 2 women from the book club in the next town over who came once a month and always spent too much, a younger man looking for a graduation gift who kept apologizing for not knowing what she liked to read. Grace spent most of the day in motion, and Daniel sat in the chair by the window with a cup of coffee going cold and red without interruption. In the late afternoon, when the last customer had gone, he closed his book and said, "You're good at that." She was straightening a display. At what? Talking to all of them differently. You knew exactly what each person needed. He said it the way you say something you've been observing for a while. The school kids, the book club women, that young man. You gave each of them something different. It's just paying attention. She moved a biography 2 inches to the left. People tell you what they need if you listen to how they're asking. Most people don't listen that way. She glanced at him. He was looking at the window, which was going dark with early evening, and the expression on his face was something she recognized, not self-pity, but a particular kind of solitude. The kind that comes not from having no one, but from having spent a long time in rooms full of people who didn't really see you. She thought about asking. She decided not to. "I'll be closing in about 20 minutes, she said instead. He stood, gathered his coat. "Of course." And then, "Same time tomorrow." She shrugged as if it were nothing. "I'll put the coffee on."
Tea.
The revelation came the way most genuine surprises do, sideways, while she was looking at something else. It was a Saturday, and she'd turned the small television behind the counter on while she took lunch in the back room, mostly for background noise. She'd eaten half a turkey sandwich and was reading the invoices that had been piling up since Tuesday when she heard the name. She didn't register it immediately. It came in the middle of something part of a news segment, the reporter's voice doing the particular confident rise that signals a name you're supposed to recognize. And then it did register, and Grace looked up. The screen showed a photograph, then cut to older footage. A keynote address in some large auditorium. A man at a podium in front of thousands of people, clear-eyed, well-dressed, speaking with the ease of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he walked into. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Daniel Mercer, former CEO, Meridian Software. Net worth estimated at $4.2 billion. She looked at the screen for a long time. The segment was short. Some mention of a philanthropic initiative, a new education fund, and then it moved on to something else. Grace sat with the half-eaten sandwich going dry on her desk, and the invoices spread around her like something she'd been in the middle of before the world shifted slightly on its axis. Daniel Mercer. She turned the name over. She thought about the plain coat, the cash, the way he'd spent 6 days in a small-town bookstore, with no phone visible, no assistant, no apparent awareness that he was a person who made headlines. She thought about the question he'd asked her on the first day. "Why do you keep it out?" And the way he'd sat in Thomas's chair reading Stegner while she sat in her own chair doing the same, and the comfortable silence between them that she'd allowed herself to enjoy more than she intended. She picked up the other half of her sandwich and put it down again. The bell above the door chimed. She already knew it was him. She took a breath. Stood. Walked out of the back room with what she hoped was a normal expression and found him in the entryway, coat damp from the drizzle, the kind of ease in his bearing that she could now read differently, the ease of a man who had spent 30 years not having to explain himself to anyone. "I just saw something on the news," she said. She watched his face. He was still for a moment. Just still the way a person is still when they've been waiting for something to arrive and have now stopped pretending it might not. "Ah," he said, "just that." And the single syllable told her more than an explanation would have, that he had known from the moment she hadn't pushed, hadn't searched, hadn't asked the obvious questions that eventually she would find out, and that he had been in some quiet corner of himself, both dreading and waiting for that moment. Grace looked at him across the length of her bookstore with its creaking floorboards and its hand-lettered index cards and its 2 chairs by the window where he had sat every afternoon for a week, and she said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. Then, "I'll put the coffee on." And she turned and walked to the back. She could hear a moment later the familiar sound of his footsteps on the boards. The same slow, careful walk he'd made through American literature on a rainy afternoon that felt longer ago than it was. She filled the kettle and kept her back to the door. Her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her, and she wasn't sure yet whether what she felt was anger or something else. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the specific, slightly dangerous sensation of being genuinely curious about another person. She hadn't felt that in years. She wasn't certain how to feel about feeling it now. She didn't say anything about it that afternoon. He seemed to understand she needed time to arrange her thoughts, the way she arranged her shelves, not haphazardly, not by whatever came to hand first. He sat in his chair. She sat in hers. They drank coffee and she read, and he didn't quite, she could feel him reading her instead, which she was aware of and chose not to address directly. The rain had settled into a steady, determined pattern against the window. A car went past on the street outside its headlights, painting a brief pale stripe across the ceiling. "I wasn't hiding it to deceive you," he said eventually. Grace turned a page. "I know." He seemed mildly surprised by the quickness of that. "You do? If you were trying to deceive me, you would have told me some other name for who you are. Something plausible enough to hold up." She looked at the page without reading it. "You just didn't volunteer the information. That's different." A pause. "Most people don't see a difference. Most people conflate omission and deception because it's easier than thinking about why someone might be quiet about something." She finally looked at him. "That's not a compliment, by the way. I'm still deciding how I feel about it." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Fair." She turned back to her book. Outside, the rain came down. A week ago, she hadn't known his name. She found that the thing she kept returning to wasn't the money. Though the money was very large and very hard to fully picture, or even the recognition, the keynote speeches, the footage of a man who commanded tens of thousands of people's attention with the confidence of someone who had earned it. What she kept returning to was this. He had sat in those chairs day after day and been ordinary in a way that had clearly required effort. She didn't know yet what to make of that, whether it was touching or strange or both, whether the man she'd been talking to for 6 days was the real version or a careful vacation from the real version. She didn't know him well enough to know the difference, which was humbling in a way she'd thought she was getting to know someone. Maybe she had been. Maybe that was the point. "Why Harwick?" she asked. He looked at the window for a moment before he answered. "I was looking for something. Information about—" He stopped, started again. "There's a woman who lived here a long time ago. Her name was Margaret Hollis. She disappeared in the late 80s. I've been trying to find out what happened to her." Grace frowned slightly. "Margaret Hollis. I don't know that name." "No reason you would. She was here before your time." He had the careful look of someone choosing how much to say. "She's connected to my family. I don't fully understand how yet." "That's why you were asking about the town history." "Yes." She considered this. Edna at the library would know better than anyone. She's been collecting local records for 30 years. "I have an appointment with her on Monday." Grace nodded. There was something deliberate in the way he'd offered that information. She thought something like a confidence, a small one, extended carefully, like a hand across a distance. She let it sit between them without making too much of it. "You should eat something if you're staying through the afternoon," she said. "I have half a sandwich in the back and I'm not going to finish it." He blinked at the shift. "Turkey," she added. "No mustard." "I don't need your—" "You've been here 4 hours and you haven't eaten, I can tell." She stood tucking a bookmark in her page. "It's not charity. I just find it distracting when someone I'm sitting with is running on coffee and stubbornness." She walked to the back room without waiting for an answer. When she came out with the sandwich on a small plate, he accepted it in silence, with a slightly self-conscious expression that she found unexpectedly human, the look of a man who was not accustomed to being looked after in small practical ways, and who wasn't sure how to receive it without either dismissing it or making it into something it wasn't. He ate the sandwich. He said thank you without making a speech about it. Outside, the rain kept on. Inside, the lamp made a warm circle near the window, and the books stood in their rows along all 4 walls, and Grace sat back down in her chair and found her page and thought, well, so this is where we are now. And she didn't quite know where that was, but she found quietly and against her own better judgment that she wasn't in any hurry to leave it. Olivia called on Sunday morning as she always did at 9:15, which Grace suspected was not an accident. Olivia knew that Grace woke at 8, made coffee, and was usually in the small chair in the kitchen by 1/2 past, and 9:15 was early enough to catch her before the day took hold, but late enough not to feel intrusive. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." The call proceeded the way their calls usually proceeded. Olivia's work, which was going well and was also exhausting. The apartment, which was fine, and also in some way Grace could hear between the lines, sometimes lonely. A friend's engagement, which Olivia mentioned neutrally in a way that wasn't neutral. Grace answered questions about the shop, about the town, about her health. She was fine. The shop was fine. Her hip wasn't giving her trouble anymore. "Have you done anything different lately?" Olivia asked, which wasn't quite a casual question. It had the careful tone of someone who is checking in without wanting to seem like they're checking in. Grace thought of Daniel sitting in Thomas's chair with his Stegner. "I've been having good conversations," she said, "with a customer. He comes in most afternoons." Grace noticed the register shift. Yes. How long has he been coming in? About a week. What's he like? Grace considered how to answer this honestly, without answering it in a way that would activate Olivia's considerable ability to turn concern into urgency. Private. Reads a great deal. Asks good questions. Olivia was quiet for a moment. You sound, I don't know, different. I'm the same. Not in a bad way, just... She seemed to be searching for the word. Energized, maybe. Grace looked at the window. The morning was pale gray, the leaves outside just starting to suggest yellow at their edges. Maybe, she said. It's nice to talk to someone who listens. She didn't say anything about the television segment. Not yet. She wasn't sure why. After they hung up, she sat with her coffee going cool in her hands and thought about that not yet. As if there were a conversation taking shape, gathering material, waiting for the right moment to be had. She was used to managing her own quiet life. She was used to her own company. She was used to the particular kind of loneliness that doesn't feel like loneliness until you're briefly, unexpectedly less lonely, and then you feel the shape of what has been absent. She didn't want to examine that too closely. She had been careful for a long time. Careful with herself, with her grief, with the slow work of becoming someone whose life was complete as it was. She had reached something she called peace, though she was aware that certain versions of peace were indistinguishable from giving up. She was 51 years old. She washed her cup and got dressed for the day and walked to the bookstore through the cool morning air, and she didn't let herself think about whether Daniel would come in or what she would say if he did, or what it meant that a small and stubborn part of her was hoping he would. She unlocked the door. She turned on the lamps. She checked the new arrivals and wrote an index card for a debut novel she'd read the night before, urgent, tender prose. The story of two women reconnecting in middle age, and she tucked it into the display. She filled the kettle. She waited for the day to begin. Chime. He came in just after 2 as the light was going amber through the front windows. He had his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and he came through the door with the slight hesitation of a person who isn't entirely sure of their welcome, something she hadn't seen in him before Saturday when everything had been easier. Still open, Grace said from behind the counter. Not warmly, not coldly. Still open, he agreed. He didn't go immediately to the chairs. He stood at the new arrivals table and looked at the index card she'd written that morning. Is this a recommendation? He said. It's what I wrote at 7 this morning because the book kept me up until 1. She kept her eyes on the ledger she was updating. Make of that what you will. She heard him pick it up. The sound of pages. She could tell from the silence when he hit a passage that caught him. He brought it to the counter. She rang it up. Their hands were near each other for a moment when he took the bag, and neither of them commented on that. I'd like to explain, he said, if you'd let me, properly. She looked at him. The afternoon light made his face difficult to read, or maybe she was still deciding how carefully to look. You don't owe me an explanation, she said. I know that. He held the bag. I'd like to give you one anyway. Outside, a car went past. Down the block, someone's dog barked twice and went quiet. Grace closed the ledger. Coffee's on, she said, and she walked to the chairs. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. 2 people sitting down in a warm room on a Sunday afternoon, the light going slowly outside the books, standing in their rows along all 4 walls. Nothing had happened yet. Nothing was certain. The question of who each of them really was, and what, if anything, they might mean to each other was still entirely open. Still so open as to be vertiginous if she let herself look at it directly. She didn't look at it directly. She sat in her chair. He sat in his. He started to speak, and she listened. He told her about Meridian, the way people tell you about the hardest years of their life. Not chronologically, not with the shape of a story that knows its ending, but in pieces, some of which fit together and some of which didn't yet. He had started the company in a garage in 1991. That was the version people knew. What people didn't know or didn't think to ask was that there had been 2 of them in that garage, Daniel and a college friend named Owen, who had died of a heart attack at 46, and whose name appeared nowhere on the company's public-facing history, because Owen's contribution had been, by the time the company went public, almost impossible to separate from Daniel's own, and because Daniel had let lawyers tell him that the simplest story was the cleanest, and that had been the first major thing he'd done that he still hadn't forgiven himself for. Grace didn't say anything when he told her that. She just looked at her hands. His family got a settlement, Daniel said. Not what he would have been worth, but what our attorneys calculated was legally defensible. Is that how you thought about it, legally defensible? At the time. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Yes, she thought about that. What changed? He was quiet for a moment. His daughter showed up at one of my foundation events about 4 years ago. She was there doing a story for a tech magazine. She didn't know who I was in the sense that she didn't connect me to her father. And I sat through a dinner with her for 2 hours knowing that I had that my choices had, and I couldn't say anything. And I thought if this is what success looks like from inside it, I've been calculating it wrong for 30 years. He said all of this without performing it. No dramatic pause, no invitation to feel sorry for him. Just the flat recitation of a man taking inventory. Grace was quiet for a while. Did you ever contact her after the dinners? I had someone reach out anonymously about an educational trust in her father's name. He almost said something else and stopped. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like something done by someone who was ashamed and hadn't yet figured out what to actually do about it. She met his eyes. Not contemptible, just unfinished. He looked at her for a moment. Most people would have let me off the hook there. I know. She picked up her coffee. I'm not most people. That seemed to mean something to him, though he didn't say what. He had been divorced for 2 years. Her name was Catherine, and he told Grace very little about her except that the divorce had been mutual. In the technical sense, they had both wanted it, and that his son Marcus's distance probably owed something to the fact that Daniel had stayed in the marriage for longer than was good for either of them, and Marcus had watched that happen from childhood and drawn his own conclusions. About what? Grace said. About whether I was capable of honesty when honesty was inconvenient. He said it plainly without self-pity, which made it more rather than less painful to hear. He's not wrong. He has a version of events that I disagree with in certain specifics, and that is at its core essentially accurate. Have you told him that? I've tried. He looked at the bookshelf across from him. The poetry section, which was alphabetical, because Grace had different rules for different sections, a fact that had briefly entertained him. We're working on the language for it. Grace thought about Olivia, about the particular work of being honest with your children about your own inadequacies. How it was harder than any other kind of honesty because they had watched you perform the story of yourself since before they could form complete sentences, and the revision process involved a lot of unlearning on both sides. That takes time, she said. More than feels fair. Yes. They sat with that for a while. Outside the window, the light had gone completely, and the street was quiet. Grace had forgotten at some point in the last hour to feel wary of him. This happened with people sometimes the letting down of a careful posture, and usually she noticed it in time to correct it. She noticed it now too late. She wasn't sure she minded. He came back Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Each time she thought, this is where it will feel different. This is where the new information will have changed the texture of the room between them, made him too large for these chairs and these walls. And each time she sat down, and he sat down, and they began talking, and something settled. The way it settled between two people who have established a real rhythm, the kind you don't engineer but simply find one day when you look. He told her about the woman he was looking for, Margaret Hollis, born 1955. She had lived in Harwick from roughly 1982 to 1988, working at the telephone company. She had been mentioned by name in a box of letters that Daniel had discovered when his mother died 2 years ago. Letters addressed to his mother from someone who signed only M and whose references to people and places had taken Daniel months to puzzle toward a name. What did the letters say? Grace asked. Some of them were ordinary. News daily life, the kind of letter you write to someone you're trying to maintain a connection with across a distance. He paused. Some of them weren't ordinary. They mentioned my father in ways that suggested... He stopped again, started differently. My father and I were not close. He was a difficult man. I had accepted a version of him that was limited. I think I understood him as a certain type of person, and I organized what I knew about our family around that understanding. These letters complicated that. Grace waited. There's a possibility, he said carefully, that Margaret Hollis was more than my mother's correspondent, that she might be connected to my father in some other way, a way that I haven't fully verified yet. He looked at his hands. I don't know what I'll find. I may find something I can't do anything useful with, but I needed to know. Of course you needed to know, Grace said. That's not a strange impulse. Some people find it strange. My son thinks he thinks I'm chasing the wrong thing. Your son has a right to his opinion. She looked at her own hands, which were folded in her lap. But grief takes different routes. Yours took you to a box of letters. That's not wrong. He looked at her. Your husband, he said, not quite a question. When he died, I reorganized the shop 3 times in 6 months, changed every label, moved every section. I thought I was improving things. I was just, she shrugged, doing something with my hands so I didn't have to do nothing with my grief. She paused. The shop is worse for it, actually. The second reorganization made very little sense. He smiled. A real one this time, the full version. She realized she had been waiting for it.
Say,
He met with Edna Marsh on a Monday and came in afterward with more questions than he'd left, with which was, as Grace told him, the sign that Edna had done her job. Edna was 81 and still organized the local archive with an exactitude that Grace found both admirable and slightly intimidating. She had been the town's unofficial historian for 4 decades. She knew or had written down everything that had ever happened in Harwick, and several things that had happened elsewhere, but had Harwick connections. If Margaret Hollis had ever set foot in this town, Edna's archive had a record of it. She was here, Daniel said. He had a small notebook the first time Grace had seen him with one, and he was consulting it with the focused expression of a man who had been given a thread and was worried about dropping it. From 1983 to 1987, telephone company, as I thought. She rented a house on Maple near the old mill building. She left in the summer of 1987, and nobody Edna spoke to ever knew why. Left or disappeared? Edna says left. She had a lease that ended and she didn't renew. She cleared out her things. There's no sign of anything dramatic. He turned a page. But there's also no trace of her after that. I've checked. No death record, no property records, no driver's license renewals after 87. She was 28 when she moved here. She'd be in her late 60s now. He looked up. Someone who was 28 in 1983 and left under ordinary circumstances should have left some kind of footprint in the 40 years since. And she hasn't. Grace considered this. So she didn't disappear from Harwick. She disappeared from everything, as far as I can find, which means either she died and it wasn't recorded, which is possible but unlikely, or she chose not to be found. He closed the notebook. And people who choose not to be found usually had a reason. A reason connected to his father, Grace thought but didn't say. Did Edna give you anything else? He hesitated, just briefly. She mentioned that Margaret had a friend here, someone she was close to. She didn't have a name, but she said there was someone, a man she thought, though she wasn't certain. Grace waited. I'm probably following a thread that will end in a knot, he said. I know that. I've been warned by people who know me that I persist at things past the point of usefulness. He looked at her with the nearest thing to self-awareness she'd seen from him, which was actually quite near. It's being brought up from the garage with me in retirement. Most people's flaws make the trip, Grace said. That's what makes them flaws instead of just habits. She said it dryly, and he laughed a short, genuine sound, surprised out of him, and Grace felt something that she told herself was just the ordinary pleasure of a joke landing. She almost believed it. The literacy fundraiser was Lena Voss's idea. Lena ran the PTA and the Community Center's board and the Informal Neighborhood Association and several other things simultaneously with the cheerful, manic competence of a woman who genuinely loved organizing people toward worthy goals. She was 44, extremely capable, and had been trying to get Grace involved in a community literacy initiative since before Thomas died, which meant she had been trying for over a decade with the patience of someone who believed in both Grace and the initiative and was willing to wait for the two to coincide. She came into the bookstore on a Thursday morning with a printout and a thermos of her own coffee, which meant she was planning to stay. The county cut the school library budget again, she announced, pouring herself into the chair across from the register. I have about 6 weeks before the spring grant deadline, and I need a local business partner with credibility, which means I need you. Grace was aware of Daniel at the far end of the store in the history section, ostensibly browsing. Ostensibly. Lena, I've told you. You've told me many things. You've also been very helpful with the last 3 book drives, even while claiming you were too busy. I am updating your file accordingly. Lena spread the printout on the counter. It was detailed. It had a timeline and a color code. I'm proposing a reading night here in the store. Local authors, maybe a couple of community readers. Charge a small door fee, all proceeds to the school libraries. She paused. I already got the permit. You got the permit before asking me. I had faith. Grace looked at the printout. Next month is very busy, she said. The permit is for the 3rd Friday of next month, which you are always closed for the Miller Book Club, And this year they rescheduled to Tuesdays, I checked. Grace looked at Lena, who looked back at her with the expression of someone who has done her homework and would like that acknowledged. Fine, Grace said. Lena beamed. Perfect. I'll need help with the author invitations, the floor plan. She stopped and looked past Grace's shoulder. I'm sorry I didn't realize you had a customer. Grace turned. Daniel had materialized near the counter with the quiet mobility of someone who wasn't used to being invisible and was in her shop, surprised to find that he could be. I don't want to interrupt, he said. We were almost done, Lena said pleasantly. Then, have we met? You look familiar. Grace watched his face. The fraction of a pause. I don't think so, he said. I'm new to the area. Daniel, Grace said with a slight and specific emphasis that she was not sure she intended. He's been coming in most days. Lena processed this with the speed and subtlety of someone who ran 5 organizations and had built a career on reading rooms. Her expression remained perfectly friendly. Lena Voss, you should come to the reading night. I'd like that, he said. After she left with her printout and her thermos and her cheerful efficiency, Daniel came to the counter. Would you like help? He said. Grace looked at him. With what? The event, the invitations, the floor plan, whatever needs organizing. He said it practically without flourish. I've coordinated large events before. I'm reasonably good at the administrative side of things. She wanted to point out that his version of a large event was probably categorically different from a reading night for 40 people in a Main Street bookstore. She could see that he knew this and had said it anyway. It doesn't pay, she said. I know. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the patient, slightly earnest expression she was coming to recognize, the one that meant he was asking for something he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. You'd have to take direction, she said. I understand. I'm told I'm particular. I believe it. She picked up a pen. Then yes, you can help. She uncapped it. But if you try to make it bigger or more complicated than it needs to be, I'll send you back to your corner. Understood. And the poetry section needs straightening before you do anything else. He almost smiled. Of course it does. She watched him go and she thought this is how things start. Not with a grand moment, but with a small practical arrangement. A fundraiser. An offer to help. The ordinary scaffolding of a life being built one ordinary plank at a time. She had forgotten what that felt like. She thought she might be remembering. Olivia called on the following Sunday at 9:15. Grace had been expecting the call and had been not quite composing what she would say about Daniel for most of the previous 24 hours, which meant she'd slept badly and woken irritable and was on her second cup of coffee before the phone rang. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. The preliminary round. Work apartment, the friend with the engagement. Then, tell me more about this customer. Grace had told Olivia at their last call that she'd found out who Daniel was. She had meant to be matter-of-fact about it. She had been mostly matter-of-fact. He's been helping with the literacy fundraiser, she said now. Silence. Then, the Billionaire is helping with the school library fundraiser. Yes. In Harwick. Yes. At your store. At my store. Grace looked out the kitchen window at the yellowing maple. He's good at the administrative side of things. Mom. Olivia's voice had taken on the particular tone, not unkind, not alarmed, just careful in a way that Grace recognized because she had deployed it herself on certain Sundays when she could hear something in her daughter's voice. What is this? It's a friendship, Olivia. 2 people who talk and are helping each other with a community event. He's a billionaire. You've mentioned that. I just mean... Olivia stopped. Started. I'm not trying to be difficult. I just don't understand why someone like that would spend his time in my small town, helping with my small fundraiser, talking to me in my small bookstore. Grace kept her voice even. Possibly because my small bookstore is a good place to spend time, and possibly because I'm not a bad person to talk to. A pause. That's not what I meant. I know. Grace softened slightly. He's going through something. He came to town looking for information about a woman who disappeared years ago. She searched for the word, quieter than his life usually lets him be. And I understand that impulse. A woman who disappeared. Olivia's voice sharpened. What woman? A historical matter. Family history. Grace paused. It's not alarming, Livy. I promise. Olivia was quiet. I just don't want you to get hurt, she said finally. And the plainness of it, the straightforwardness so unlike her usual careful language, made Grace's throat tighten briefly. I know, Grace said. I'm not thinking about that. What does that mean? It means I'm being careful. A pause. I'm always careful. which was true, and which was also, she had begun to recognize, a partial description of how she had been living for a long time. After they hung up, she sat with the phone in her lap and thought about the word careful. Careful was good. Careful kept you from making mistakes. Careful had gotten her through 8 years of widowhood without falling apart or making any catastrophic decisions. Careful had also kept her at a certain remove from her own life. She finished her coffee, got up, washed the cup. She walked to the bookstore through the crisp morning with her coat buttoned and her keys in her hand, and she thought, be careful. Yes, but also maybe be a little less certain that careful is always the same thing as safe. He found the photograph on a Wednesday in the archive at the Harwick Public Library. He told her about it on a Thursday, standing in the doorway of the back room, where she was sorting invoice copies, holding a printout from the county records database with the careful expression of a man who has found something unexpected and hasn't yet decided what it means. There were photographs in the archive, he said, from a community event in 1985, the town centennial celebration. Edna had them in a box that hadn't been digitized yet. He held up the printout. It was a scan of a black and white photograph. Grace, I need you to look at this. Something in his voice made her put down the invoices. She took the printout. It was a group photograph. A summer event, she could tell the lawn and the old bandstand in the background. People in light clothing, paper cups, and bunting. 20, maybe 25 people arranged in the easy, loosely spaced way of a casual community photograph. Nobody quite looking at the camera at the same moment. On the left edge of the group, slightly separate from the others, a woman in a light dress. Young. Late 20s, early 30s, dark hair. Looking at the camera with a directness that made her stand out from the blur of the larger group. Beside her, a man, tall, fair, a smile she recognized with a physical certainty that preceded thought. Grace stood very still. The man in the photograph standing beside Margaret Hollis at the Harwick Centennial in 1985, 3 years before Grace had ever come to this town, was Thomas, her husband. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she set it very carefully on the stack of invoices and looked at the wall. Grace, Daniel said. I know, she said. Her voice came out quiet and level. Give me a minute. He gave her the minute. Outside, the Thursday afternoon went on without them. Inside, Grace stood in her back room with the photograph on the stack of invoices and tried to understand what it meant to look at a picture of the man you had loved and buried and grieved and rebuilt yourself around and find that he had been standing beside a mystery you'd never been told about in the town where you would one day inherit his bookstore and his life and his version of his own history. She was very calm. She was aware distantly that she might not be calm for very long. But for right now, for this minute, she stood in the room that smelled like Thomas's bookstore, and she was absolutely, perfectly, carefully still.
Man.
She asked him to leave for the day. He went without argument. He put on his coat and picked up his bag and said, I'll come back tomorrow if you'd like, or not if you'd rather. And then he left, and she listened to his steps on the boards and the bell above the door, and then there was nothing. She locked up early. She put the printout in the drawer beneath the register. She walked home through the October chill and made dinner she didn't eat and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine. She only sipped and looked at the photograph she had on her phone. She had photographed the printout before putting it away mechanically, the way you document things that might otherwise be argued away later. Thomas, in 1985. He would have been 28. She had not yet met him. They wouldn't meet until 1991 at a conference in Boston, where both of them had ended up for unrelated reasons and spent an afternoon looking at the same exhibition. She knew who he had been at 28, in the same way you know who a person was before you knew them, through stories, through the photographs she had seen, through the way he occasionally talked about Harwick before her. He had never mentioned Margaret Hollis. She turned her phone face down. She thought about what he had mentioned, about the town in those years. He had talked about the telephone company, the Centennial. He had talked about various town events, the people he'd grown up with, the feeling of the place before it got a bit quieter as the mills closed. He had told her stories for 12 years, the ordinary, sustained narrative of a life shared with someone, and this woman had not appeared in any of them. That could mean almost nothing, or it could mean something. She went to bed and lay awake until 1 in the morning and thought, you don't know what it means. You're not going to decide what it means at 1 in the morning based on a single photograph. You're going to sleep, and in the morning, you're going to go to work, and you are going to think clearly, and you're going to find out what you actually know. She slept at 1:15. She was at the shop by 8. Papa. Daniel came in at 2. He came with 2 coffees from the cafe down the street, which was a departure from their usual routine, where she made the coffee, and she understood this as a gesture, the kind that says, I know this is difficult, and here is the only small thing I can offer. She took the coffee. They sat in the chairs. I want to tell you what I know, he said. All of it, not in pieces. Please. He told her about his father, Edmund Mercer, who had been a contractor in the 90s before Daniel's company had made the family's finances irrelevant, and who had been the careful, honest word Daniel chose was difficult. Difficult to know. Capable of warmth in specific conditions and of a significant coldness under different ones. He had died when Daniel was 43, and their relationship had never fully resolved itself in either direction. His mother Eleanor had kept things. Letters, documents the small archival evidence of a life carefully maintained. When she died, Daniel had gone through the boxes with the expectation of finding nothing surprising, and had found the letters from M. 17 letters over 4 years, 1984 to 1987. His mother's replies were not in the box, which meant either M had kept them or they were gone. What remained were M's letters to his mother, careful, affectionate, occasionally pleading in a way that suggested a relationship under pressure. The letters made clear, Daniel said slowly, that M. Margaret felt she was in a situation she needed help getting out of. She didn't say exactly what the situation was, but she referenced my father by name in 2 of them. Not fondly. He held his coffee cup in both hands. One letter said, Edmund has made certain promises which I no longer believe he will keep. If I am wrong, I will be grateful. If I am right, I will need to make decisions that I would prefer not to make. He looked at Grace. I think my father had an affair with her, he said. I think she may have been pregnant. I think whatever he promised her, whether that was acknowledgement or money or some version of a future, he didn't follow through. And I think she left because staying had become impossible. He paused. I don't know if the child she may have been carrying is still alive. I don't know if she is. But a person who chooses not to leave a trace usually does so because they want to be unfindable. And she found a way to be completely unfindable. Grace absorbed this. She was friends with Thomas, Grace said. It appears so, from the photograph. He never told me about her. He may not have known what he knew. Daniel said it carefully. People don't always understand the significance of things they witnessed. He may have been her friend and seen things and not understood what he was seeing. He paused. Or he may have understood and not told you. I don't know which. Grace nodded slowly. I don't know which either, she said. They sat with that for a while, the clean, uncomfortable fact of not knowing which is so much harder than most people anticipate. Most people are afraid of difficult truths. Grace had found in her life that the not knowing was often worse than whatever waited on the other side of it. What do you want to do? She asked. He seemed surprised by the question, not by the question itself, but by the we implied in it. The assumption that this was something they were navigating together. Keep looking, he said. I want to find her if she's alive, or find out what happened if she isn't. He looked at his coffee. I don't know what I'll do when I find it, but I need to know. I'd like to look too, Grace said. Grace, he was my husband. She said it quietly without drama. Whatever he knew or didn't know. Whatever was true before I knew him. She looked at Daniel steadily. I'd like to understand what happened. I have that right. He looked at her. Yes, he said finally. You do. She picked up her coffee. Then we looked together. Outside the window, a woman walked past with a stroller head down against the wind, moving quickly the way people move when they're cold and know where they're going. The afternoon light was thin and pale. In the trees along the street, the last of the leaves were letting go. Grace watched until the woman turned the corner. She thought I spent 8 years learning who I was without Thomas. Now I find out I may have to learn who he was without him too. She thought this is a different kind of grief. She thought I can do this. She sat in the chair. She held her coffee. She did not look at the man sitting in the next chair to see if the steadiness she felt was real or performed because she was not sure she wanted to know the answer and because some things are better held as questions a little while longer. Outside, the last leaves fell. Inside, something had shifted between them. Not moved toward sentiment, not made itself too easy, but shifted nonetheless in the specific direction of people who have moved from parallel solitudes to something genuinely shared. The weight of what they were carrying had been redistributed, and both of them felt it, and neither of them said so. and the afternoon went on. The county records office in Branton was 40 minutes southeast of Harwick, in a municipal building that smelled of industrial cleaner and aging carpet, staffed by a woman named Doris, who had been answering questions about historical property records and vital statistics for 19 years, and had the particular competence of someone who is never asked to exceed her considerable expertise. Grace drove. Daniel sat in the passenger seat of her 10-year-old Subaru with a legal pad on his knee and did not comment on the car's age or the fact that it needed the front left speaker replaced, though he did wince slightly at the sound it made. "If you say anything about the speaker, I'll charge you for gas," Grace said. "I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it." "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that the rest of the car seems to be in excellent condition." She glanced at him. He looked ahead at the road. "Better," she said. Doris gave them 30 minutes and the complete holdings on Margaret Hollis, which amounted to a single property record, a rental. The address on Maple Street from 1983 to 1987. A voter registration dated 1984, and a library card issued in March of 1986 and not renewed. No birth certificate on file because Margaret had been born in New Hampshire, not Massachusetts. No death certificate. No marriage record. "Did she leave any forwarding information?" Daniel asked. "I can check." Doris typed for a moment. Frowned. "No, the rental record just has the end of lease date. Nothing after." "Is there anything about next of kin emergency contacts on the rental application?" Doris pulled the physical file. The rental application was one page typed on what had clearly been an actual typewriter with the particular smudges of carbon paper around the margins. She turned it to face them across the counter. "Emergency contact Daniel Mercer, Boston, Massachusetts." Grace heard Daniel's breathing change. "That's your mother," Grace said quietly. "Yes." His voice was careful. "Yes, it is." They drove back mostly in silence, not the comfortable silence of the bookstore chairs. A thinking silence, the kind that needs to be respected, because the thoughts inside it are still finding their shape. At the edge of Harwick, when the trees opened up and the town came into view, Daniel said, "She put my mother as her emergency contact, which means by 1983, before the first of those letters, they already knew each other well enough for that." "Your father might have introduced them," Grace said. "If the relationship with your father started before she came to Harwick, or she came to Harwick because of my father, followed him, or he arranged it. The town came up around them. The familiar streets, the hardware store, the pharmacy. The white steeple of the Congregational Church in the exact place she'd first seen it 18 years ago. "There's a woman," Grace said. "Marian Abbott. She must be in her 80s now, lives on the east side of town. She worked at the telephone company in the 80s. I know her because she's been a customer since before I took the store over. She comes in every month for large print fiction." She turned onto Main Street. "She might have known Margaret. You want to talk to her?" "I think we should." She parked outside the shop. "Today is too much for one day, but we should talk to her." He sat for a moment after she'd killed the engine. "I keep thinking about what it means," he said, "that Margaret put my mother's name down. My father's wife." He looked at the storefront. She was his whatever she was, and she put his wife as her emergency contact. That's not an accident. That's someone trying to say something she couldn't say directly. Grace thought about this. "Or someone who needed a witness," she said. "Someone who wanted one person in that world to know exactly what was happening." He looked at her. "That's darker," he said. "I know." He got out of the car. She got out of the car. They stood on the sidewalk in the cold afternoon and both looked at the bookstore sign, which Thomas had painted himself in the imperfect hand of a man who had learned to do most things well enough but had not been a natural letterer. "Come in for a minute," she said. "I have soup from yesterday." He didn't argue. She held the door for him, and he ducked slightly under the low frame, which she'd always meant to raise and never had, and they went inside. Betty. Marian Abbott came to the store on a Thursday, as she always did for her large print fiction. She was 83 and moved slowly, but thought quickly with the alert, watchful intelligence of someone who had spent a long life among people and learned to read them efficiently. She had been widowed twice and seemed to regard both losses as significant and also as manageable, which Grace had always found privately encouraging. She had found her copy of the month's Debbie Macomber before Grace was ready to raise the subject. Daniel was at the back of the shop in the history section, which was where he positioned himself when he wanted to not be obvious about paying attention. "Marian," Grace said, "I wanted to ask you something about someone who worked at the telephone company in the 80s. Marian looked at her over the large print display. Which someone, Margaret Hollis. A pause. Not a long one, but specific. Oh, Marian said. I haven't heard that name in a long time. You knew her. We worked together, yes. For about 3 years. She set the macumber on the counter and looked at Grace with the direct gaze of someone who has decided to be honest and is letting you know in advance. What's this about Grace? I'm trying to find out what happened to her, where she went. Marian was quiet for a moment. Then she tilted her head slightly toward the back of the shop. Is he part of this? Grace glanced back. Daniel had gone very still in the history section. Yes, Grace said. Marian considered. She picked up the macumber. She looked at it. She put it back down. Margaret was a good person, she said. She was bright and funny, and she had more going on underneath than most people around here ever saw. She folded her hands on the counter. She was also in a situation that I didn't fully understand at the time and understood better later. What kind of situation? Marian looked at her, then passed her to Daniel, who had come forward and was standing at a respectful distance. Then back at Grace. She was involved with the man who had no intention of being involved with her publicly. He had a family elsewhere. He had told her things that turned out not to be true. She said it plainly without embellishment. When she became pregnant, he panicked. He gave her money. He told her to go somewhere else and not come back. Marian stopped. She was 29 years old and she was alone here. Her family was in New Hampshire and she had complicated her relationships with them by coming here in the first place. She had one friend she trusted and he was Thomas, Grace said. Marian looked at her. The compassion in her expression was very careful. Yes. Grace kept her breathing even. What did Thomas know? He knew she was pregnant. He knew the general shape of the situation, not the man's name. She was careful about that. She didn't want to put Thomas in a position. Marian paused. He helped her find a place to stay when she decided to leave. He drove her to the bus station the summer of '87. She said she was going to start over somewhere nobody knew her. She folded and unfolded her hands. He never heard from her again. I know because he asked me once a few years later if I'd had any word. He felt terrible about it. Grace looked at the counter Thomas had built. He never told me, she said. He probably didn't know what to tell you or whether it was his story to tell. Marian's voice was gentle. He was a private man about some things. You know that. Grace did know that. The baby, Daniel said. He had come fully forward now, and his voice was steady in a way that required effort. Grace could hear the effort. What happened to the baby? Marian looked at him carefully. Are you the child? A silence. I might be her half-sibling, Daniel said. The man involved may be my father. Marian held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Grace. Then back at him. She didn't go through with it, Marian said. She had decided to keep the child as of when she left. She was showing by then. Thomas had given her what money he had, which wasn't much. He was just starting the bookstore. She paused. I don't know what happened after the bus station. I don't know if the child was born or where they went or who they became. She could still be alive. The child could be 40 years old now. She looked at her hands. I'm sorry I can't tell you more. You've told us a great deal, Daniel said. Thank you. Marian picked up her macumber. She was a good person, she said again. She deserved better than what she got. Most of them do. She met Grace's eyes. So did you. You should know that. Whatever Thomas didn't tell you wasn't about you. It was about a man who kept things separate because he didn't know how to reconcile them and who probably thought he was protecting everyone by doing so. Grace managed a nod. She charged Marian for the book. She watched her go. She stood at the counter for a long moment after the bell stopped ringing. Grace, Daniel said. I'm all right. She straightened the stack of new arrivals. I'm not all right yet, but I will be. He stood at the counter across from her and didn't say the obvious things which she was grateful for. He looked at her with the attention she had come to count on, the specific attention of someone who sees the whole person and doesn't require the simplified version. He helped her, Grace said finally. He drove her to the bus station with whatever money he had. She looked at the door Marian had left through. That was Thomas. Yes. He couldn't fix it. He wasn't... She stopped. He was 28, and someone he cared about needed help he couldn't fully give. So he gave what he had. She felt the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. Not fully, not yet, but the direction was clear. That was also Thomas. She smoothed her hand over the counter. I'm going to cry at some point, she said. Not now, but later, probably this evening, possibly loudly. She met his eyes. I'm telling you because it seems relevant. Something moved in his expression. Noted, he said quietly. Good. She took a breath. Now. Margaret left Harwick in the summer of 1987. She was pregnant, and she didn't have much money, and she had no plan except somewhere nobody knows her. She looked at him. Where do you go? What do you do? You change your name, he said. Yes. They looked at each other. She didn't disappear, Grace said. She became someone else. She let that settle. And that means she's findable. Different name, different place, same age. There's a child probably who was born in the fall of 1987 or the winter of 1988. She straightened a book on the counter. We know more than we did this morning. We do, he said. Is that enough to keep going? Yes. Then let's keep going. The literacy fundraiser was 2 Fridays later, and Harwick turned out for it in a way that surprised even Lena, who had the optimism of someone who expected good things and was still occasionally startled when good things happened. 43 people came. Every chair was filled, and the overflow stood along the back wall and the sides. A local poet named Carl Fisk read 3 pieces about the coast that made 2 people cry. A retired school librarian named Bernadette spoke for 15 minutes about what school libraries had meant to her over 40 years of teaching, and by the end of it, there was not a dry eye in the first 3 rows. Daniel had helped with the chairs. He had moved furniture and checked the sound system and made sure the sign-up sheet for the book drive was visible near the door without anyone asking him to. He did all of it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who knows how to make things work and doesn't need to be seen doing it. Lena found Grace near the register during the intermission, slightly flushed with the success of it, pressing a cup of cider into Grace's hand. He's very useful, Lena said quietly, tilting her head toward Daniel, who was helping an older man find his way to a chair. He is. He also looks at you. Lena's voice was not quite neutral. When you're not looking. Grace sipped her cider. Lena, I'm not saying anything. I'm just reporting data. She looked at the room with satisfaction. We've raised $600 before the second half. I think we'll hit 1,000. She squeezed Grace's arm. Good idea, this. Your idea. I'm generous with credit, Lena said, and drifted away. Grace stood at the edge of her own store and watched it full of people, and thought Thomas would have loved this. He would have stood here with his arms folded and that private pleased expression he wore when something he cared about was going well, and he would have said something dry and slightly underplayed about how he couldn't believe people were coming out on a Friday night. She thought, I know who you were. I may learn things I didn't know, but I know who you were. She thought that's enough. She thought it again and found she mostly believed it. Daniel was across the room helping rearrange a row of chairs for the second half, and he glanced up at that moment and found her watching him. He didn't look away. She didn't either. Just a moment, 2-3 seconds before someone moved between them and they went back to whatever they were each supposed to be doing. It was nothing, and it was also not nothing. And Grace set her cider cup down on the counter and straightened her cardigan and went to help Lena with the second half, and she thought, be careful. Yes, but also be awake.
Hattie.
The woman arrived on a Tuesday. Grace was shelving returns when the bell rang, and she looked up and registered first a woman in her late 50s or early 60s, well-dressed in the way of someone who spent money on clothing without announcing it. Dark hair going silver, the kind of posture that speaks of a life lived among rooms that expected something from you. She did not look like a browser. She looked at Grace with the direct assessment of someone deciding something, and then she said, You're Grace Whitmore. I am. My name is Catherine Mercer. A brief pause. Daniel's ex-wife. Grace put the returns on the nearest shelf. She turned fully. She kept her expression level. What can I help you with? She said. Catherine Mercer looked around the shop with the expression of someone doing a rapid evaluation, and Grace understood that she was being evaluated too, her age, her appearance, the whole humble fact of her life as represented by these shelves and this counter and this town. I heard he's been spending time here, Catherine said. A lot of time. He has. I wanted to see for myself. She met Grace's eyes. I'm not hostile. I want to be clear about that. I'm curious. Grace said nothing. She waited. She had learned a long time ago that silence in these moments did more useful work than speaking. He's not people have a version of Daniel that isn't accurate, Catherine said. The version where he's a villain or a saint depending on who you talk to. He's neither. She paused. But he has certain habits, certain patterns. She turned her gaze directly on Grace. He falls into things. He is capable of enormous warmth and also of a very clean, very complete withdrawal. When it ends quickly, and it doesn't look the way you expected. Are you warning me about something specific? Grace asked. Or is this general advice? I'm not sure. Catherine looked at the window. I drove here because I wasn't sure, which probably tells you something about my own state of affairs that I'm not proud of. She turned back. We're not reconciling if that's what you're wondering. It's genuinely over. But he was my life for 26 years, and whatever I think of how it ended, I find I don't want... She stopped. I find I still have opinions about what happens to him. Grace looked at this woman, this carefully composed, unexpectedly honest woman, and thought, of course you do. Of course you still have opinions about the man you spent 26 years next to. I appreciate you coming, Grace said. I do. Catherine looked at her. That's not the response I expected, she said. I imagine not. Grace picked up the return she'd set down. For what it's worth, I'm not in the business of not being careful. I have no illusions about being in a simple situation. She looked at Catherine. But I'm also 51 years old, and I have been careful for a long time, and I've started to wonder whether careful is something I want to spend the rest of my life being. Catherine held her gaze for a moment. Then to Grace's surprise, she smiled just slightly wry and almost warm. He does that, she said. He makes people ask themselves questions like that. That part I can confirm is real. She buttoned her coat. He also runs from the answers, just so you know. She walked to the door. I'll keep it in mind, Grace said. The bell rang, and Grace stood in her quiet store and held the stack of returns and thought, well, that's a complication. Outside, she heard a car start and pull away. She thought yes, but not the kind of complication that means stop, the kind that means proceed carefully with your eyes open, which she intended to do, which she thought she had been doing all along. She set the returns on the right shelf. She turned on the lamp near the reading chairs. She thought about Margaret Hollis on a bus in the summer of 1987, pregnant and scared and heading somewhere nobody knew her, and she thought people find a way through. People change their names and keep going and survive things they didn't think they could survive. She was still thinking about it when the bell rang again and Daniel came in, his coat damp from the light rain, and looked at her face and said, What happened? I'll tell you, she said. Come in, sit down. And she picked up the kettle and put it on. And outside the rain fell on Harwick, steady and patient, the way rain falls on towns that have been standing long enough to have outlasted most of what they were afraid of. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to expect. When she was done, he was quiet for a full 30 seconds, which she had also come to expect because he was a man who didn't speak before he'd thought. She had no reason to come here except me, he said. She's not... He stopped. I should have anticipated this. She does things like this. Is she dangerous? He looked at her. No, she's not a bad person. She's someone who doesn't know what to do with things that are unresolved. He set down his coffee. She said he runs from the answers. Yes. Do you believe her? Grace turned this over. I believe she was telling her truth. Whether her truth is accurate? She looked at him. Do you run from answers? A long pause. I have, he said. I'm trying not to. That's the honest version, she said. I appreciate the honest version. He looked at the rain on the window. She came all the way here. She did. That's not... He seemed to be working something through. We've been officially divorced for 2 years. We separated a year before that. I don't... He stopped. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear me work through my ex-wife. I'm not minding it, Grace said. It tells me things. What things? She considered. That your life before this was more complicated than you usually say. That complicated doesn't just end because papers get signed. She wrapped both hands around her mug. That you're more worth paying attention to than someone with a simple history. He looked at her. That's generous, he said. It's accurate. She looked at her mug. My life is also more complicated than it looked 2 weeks ago, so we're even. He was quiet. Then, have you forgiven him, Thomas? She thought about it honestly. I don't know if forgiveness is quite the right word, she said. I understand him better than I did. I know what he did it was kind. The way he helped her, he was kind. She paused. What he didn't do is tell me, and I'm working with that. I think I needed to know it to finish something, some chapter of the grief that I thought was finished but apparently wasn't. She looked at the rain. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. Yes, it does. The lamp on the table between the chairs made its quiet, warm circle. I want to find her, Grace said. Margaret, or find out what happened. I think I need that as much as you do now. She looked at him steadily, possibly for different reasons. He nodded. Then we'll find her, he said. Outside, someone's umbrella turned inside out in the wind. Inside, the rain ran down the windows, and the lamp kept its circle, and two people in their 50s sat in adjacent chairs in a small bookstore in a small New England town and made each other a promise that neither of them took lightly because they were not people who made promises lightly. That was another thing they had in common. They were both finding there were quite a few of those.
Bye.
The reporter arrived on a Friday morning. He was young 30s, Grace guessed, with the particular ease of someone whose job required him to seem harmless. He came into the shop looking at his phone, glanced up, glanced around with the too casual assessment she'd seen before in people who were doing reconnaissance, and then came to the counter. Grace Whitmore.
Was a guess.
I'm doing a piece for the Boston Globe. Features section. He smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had been told he had good rapport. I understand Daniel Mercer has been spending time in Harwick. I wanted to ask you a few questions. Grace looked at him. She thought about what she wanted to say and chose the simplest true version. I don't have anything to say about Mr. Mercer's private life, she said. He's a customer. I hope you have a good trip back. He set a card on the counter. We're running the piece regardless. I'd just like to give you the chance to be part of the narrative. Grace looked at the card. She thought someone told him. Someone in Harwick, or near it, or connected to it, gave this reporter exactly what he needed to know. She thought Catherine, or not Catherine. It could have been anyone. A well-meaning person posting to social media. Someone who recognized him and said something to someone else. The ordinary, permeable nature of a small-town life. She picked up the card and put it in the drawer under the register. I hope you have a good trip back, she said again. He went. She stood at the counter after he'd gone and understood clearly and without panic that something had changed. The quiet town, the afternoon chairs, the particular privacy of the last month that was over or soon would be. The world outside, which had been leaving them alone, was about to involve itself. She picked up her phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. She told him. A pause. I'll come, he said. That would be fine, she said. She put the phone down. She looked around her store, the shelves, the chairs, the lamp, the index cards in their pale yellow holders along the wall. Everything exactly where it had been, exactly as she'd arranged it, exactly as it had been arranged before her and would be after. She thought, whatever happens, this is still here. She thought that's something. She thought that may not be enough. She didn't know yet which of those was true. She went to put the coffee on, and she waited for what was coming. The Globe piece ran on a Thursday, which was not when Grace had expected it, but was when the Friday morning visitor apparently decided to file. Tech billionaire finds bookstore romance in small Massachusetts town. She read it on her phone in the back room before she opened with her coffee getting cold. It was not a hostile piece. That was almost worse. It was warm and wry and narrative in the way that feature journalism is narrative. It had a clear arc, a clear heroine, a clear implication, and it mentioned the bookstore's name and address twice. Once in the text and once in the caption of a photograph taken through the front window that she had not consented to and that showed clearly the two reading chairs and the lamp between them. She closed the app. She opened the store. The first unusual thing happened at 9:15. A woman she'd never seen before came in specifically to tell her she thought the story was beautiful and to buy whatever Daniel had been reading, which she determined from the article was Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. Grace sold her a copy. The second unusual thing happened at 10. A man she also didn't recognize came in and asked if he could take a photo. Of the store, he said, as if this were clarifying. I'd rather you didn't, Grace said. He took one anyway on his way out, and she watched him do it through the window. By noon, she had sold 11 books, which was a Thursday record, and none of the buyers were familiar faces. By 2, she had fielded 2 phone calls from journalists, one of whom identified himself as representing a syndicate she'd never heard of. By 4, she was exhausted, and her regular customers, the ones she'd known for years, were not coming in because the sidewalk out front had acquired a quality of foot traffic that made it feel different, not quite crowded, but pointed. Purposeful in the wrong way. She was restocking the biography section when the bell rang, and she turned, and it was Daniel. He looked as though he'd been having the same kind of day. I spoke to the paper, he said. They're not going to run a follow-up, but I can't make the first piece disappear. I know. My publicist? I have a publicist. She's retired, but she checks in on things. She says there are two more journalists asking questions. One is doing a piece about whether my philanthropy work is genuine. One is doing a piece about, he stopped, about you, specifically. Grace set down the biography she was holding. What kind of piece? The kind that suggests someone in your position has certain interests in someone in mine. He said it flat without hedging. It's framed as a question. It won't be answered as one. Grace looked at the shelf. She had known this was coming in some form. She had registered it as a possibility 2 weeks ago when they were driving back from Branton and talking about Margaret Hollis, and it had felt like their own private thing, their own private search, and she'd thought this can't stay that way forever. She had been right. Is there anything you can do? She said. I can issue a statement, something neutral. I can have my lawyer send a letter to the more aggressive one. He paused. It usually helps a little. It doesn't usually stop it. She nodded. Grace? He took a step toward her. He had never done that before, moved toward her with intention, crossed the ordinary conversational distance. I'm sorry. This is the attention, the scrutiny. I've lived with it for a long time. I forget that other people haven't. She looked at him. You didn't plan the article, she said. No. But my being here made it possible. My being here made you... He stopped. Visible. In ways you didn't choose. She turned this over for a moment. Let me think about it, she said. I need a day. Of course. She looked at him steadily. I'm not angry at you. I want to be clear about that. I'm figuring something out. He nodded. He seemed to understand the difference. He bought a book, a new one. A novel she'd recommended the week before, which she'd been wondering if he was going to get around to, and he left with a look that was trying not to ask questions she hadn't answered yet. She locked up. She went home. She thought. The thinking took most of the night. What she was thinking about was not exactly the article. The article was the symptom. What she was thinking about was the larger question of what it meant to be a 51-year-old woman with a small business and a quiet life who had opened a door she hadn't fully understood she was opening, and whether closing that door now at this point would be protection or surrender. She had protected herself for 8 years. Protection looked like keeping the shop exactly as Thomas had left it in many ways. Keeping the chairs, keeping the index cards. Living within a life shaped largely by choices another person had made, because those choices were good choices, and she had been grateful for the life they'd built, and because changing things felt like arguing with grief, and she'd been too tired for that argument for a very long time. She had been less tired lately. She was aware of this. She was also aware that awareness was not a plan. At 1 a.m, she turned off the light and lay in the dark and said out loud to no one, Thomas, I found out about Margaret. I know you helped her. I know why you didn't tell me. I'm not angry at you. Then I'm doing something. I don't know what it is yet. I'm not sure it's safe. I know you'd tell me to be careful. Then quietly to herself, I know. I know you would. I also know that you were not always careful. You drove her to the bus station. You gave her the money. You were not careful either when someone needed you not to be. She slept. The comments started the next day. She found them by accident. Someone had linked the Globe article to a local business group's social media page, and the comments had proliferated in the way comments do, which is to say, badly. Most of them were benign or supportive. A meaningful number were not. The not benign ones had a shape she recognized from having seen it applied to other women in other contexts. Assumptions about motivation, assumptions about character. The particular reductiveness applied to women of a certain age who appear near wealthy men. A few used the word gold digger with the casual confidence of people who believe they are being perceptive. One referred to her bookstore as probably just a prop. She did not read all of them. She read enough. She closed the laptop. She called Lena. Lena answered on the first ring, which meant Lena had already been following the situation with the alert efficiency she applied to everything. I was going to call you, Lena said. I know. Grace sat at the kitchen table. Tell me what you're hearing. Lena was honest. Some people were being supportive. Some people were being cautious, which in a small town meant they were waiting to see how this landed before committing to an opinion. A few people, a very few, had said things that weren't kind. They're wrong, Lena said. Anyone who knows you knows they're wrong. Most people don't know me, Grace said. Most people reading about me have no idea who I am. Then what they think doesn't matter. No. But they affect things. They affect whether people feel comfortable coming into the store. They affect... She stopped. I've had a slow week. Customers who know me are giving the shop space. I understand that. I appreciate the instinct, but it has a practical effect. Lena was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? Grace looked at the window. The maple outside was bare now, all the leaves down the branches making their clean winter geometry against the November sky. I'm thinking I need to make a decision, she said, about the relationship and about the store. They're separate decisions, Lena said. Are they? A pause. Maybe not entirely, Lena admitted, but they should be. After she hung up, Grace sat for a while longer. She thought about the word relationship, which she hadn't used before even to herself. She had used friendship. She had used arrangement. She had been very careful with language with herself because language has weight, and she knew it. Relationship. She tried it again. She thought, yes, that's what it is. Whether or not it's gone anywhere, whether or not it goes anywhere from here. That's what it is. She thought so. What do you do with that? She thought be honest about it, and then decide. She told him the following Monday that she needed to step back. She did it in the shop in the chairs, which felt appropriate. It was where everything had happened, and she wanted the honesty of that setting. She made the coffee. She sat down. He sat down. She told him, I think we need less, she said. For now, less frequency. Less. She looked for the word. Proximity. He was very still. Because of the article, he said. Because of what the article revealed, which is that we've built something quite quickly that I hadn't examined as carefully as I should have. She looked at him. I'm not saying it was a mistake. I'm saying I need to understand it better before the external pressure makes the choice for me. The external pressure. I know you can manage the press. I know you have resources I don't have and access to tools that can help. She held his eyes. That's part of the issue. You can make this easier in ways that I can't, and if I let you do that, I don't know whether I chose this because I chose it or because I found it easier to stay than to go. She paused. That would make me someone I don't want to be. He was quiet for a long moment. I understand, he said. I don't agree that those things are as separate as you're making them, but I understand. What don't you agree with? That accepting help is the same as being swept along. He looked at his hands. I think you're attributing a passivity to yourself that isn't accurate. Maybe. She looked at the window. I've been passive before in my life, in ways I didn't notice until later. This isn't that. I know, but I need to be certain. He held her gaze. She held his. How long? He said. I don't know. Sometime. Are you asking me to leave Harwick? She thought about it. No, I'm asking you to give me the space to find out what I actually want without you in the room, making it easier to want a particular thing. He almost smiled despite himself. Is my presence that influential? Yes, she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said to him yet, and she felt it land. He looked at his coffee. I have the search, he said. I may have a lead. Someone who might know where Margaret went. Tell me. He did. It was a phone number, a woman in Vermont who had been a friend of Margaret's from her New Hampshire years, a connection so attenuated that it might be nothing, might be everything. You should follow it, Grace said. I was planning to drive up on Wednesday. Then I'll be here when you get back. She picked up her coffee. I'll also be here either way. I want you to know that. I'm not stepping back from the search. I'm stepping back from... She gestured vaguely between them. From me. From what I think about you, temporarily. She met his eyes. Until I've thought it properly. He nodded slowly. He stood to leave. At the door he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, whatever you're deciding, I'd rather you take the time than not. He held the door frame. I've made decisions in my life before I was ready to make them. That turned out badly. I'd rather wait. I know, she said. He left. She sat in her chair for a long time after in the quiet store, and she thought that was the right thing. That was the true thing. That was not retreat. It was clarity. And she knew the difference. He called her from Vermont on a Thursday evening. She answered on the second ring. She had been reading a lot in the week since their conversation, with the particular absorption of someone using books, as they were intended not as escape, but as company. Her name is now Helen Marsh, he said. She's 68. She lives outside of Montpellier. She's been there for 35 years. Grace set down her book. You found her. I'm sitting in a diner 2 miles from her house. His voice was very careful. I haven't gone yet. I wanted to, I don't know. I wanted to tell you first. She held the phone. How are you? She said. A pause. Terrified, honestly. Yes. She doesn't know I'm coming. I found the address through her friend who didn't know whether to give it to me. I said I would only come if she was willing, and the friend said she'd ask, and he stopped. The friend called back this afternoon and said she'd agreed to see me tomorrow morning. Daniel. Grace looked at her lamp, the room around her, the ordinary room she'd lived alone in for 8 years. However it goes, you've done right by this. You went looking for the truth about your family, and you're about to find it, whatever it is. You're not here, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact said plainly. No, I know why, I understand why. He paused. I just wanted to say it. She closed her eyes for a moment. Go, she said. Go tomorrow morning. Call me after. Yes. And drive carefully. The roads up there get icy early. She could hear him almost smile. All right, Grace. She put the phone down. She sat with the lamp and the book and the room and thought about a woman in Vermont who had become someone else 35 years ago and was about to be found by the son of the man who had made her disappear. She thought about what Margaret Hollis Helen Marsh might have felt when she agreed to see him. Relief. Fear. The specific gravity of old things that haven't been fully set down. She thought tomorrow she finds out what she can live with knowing. She thought I already know what I can live with knowing. That's the part I've been working out all week. She thought I've been careful long enough to know that careful is not the same as safe, and safe is not the same as alive. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. She slept and did not dream, and woke in the morning to frost on the window and a clarity she'd been working toward for weeks. He called the next afternoon from the road back. She's real, he said. She's fine. She's made a good life. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not quite broken. Rearranged. She had a daughter who is 38 now, my half-sister. A pause. She lives in Providence. She doesn't know about my father. She knows her mother's history, at least some of it, but she doesn't know the name. What did Margaret say? Helen. He corrected himself gently. She goes by Helen. She said she'd spent a long time angry, and a longer time past angry, and that she'd made peace with the fact that some things don't get resolved cleanly. She didn't want money. She didn't want anything from me, I think, except to be believed. His voice steadied. She said my father was not a good man in the ways that mattered. She said she had no desire to reopen anything, but she said... He stopped. She said she was glad someone had come looking, even after all this time. She said it mattered that someone had. Grace was quiet. That's something, she said. Yes. He paused. She asked about my mother, whether my mother knew she'd had the baby. I told her I thought my mother had known and had kept the letters because she was someone who kept the things that mattered, even when they were painful, even when she couldn't act on them. He paused. Helen cried a little when I said that. She said your mother was kind. That was the word she used. Grace pressed her hand flat on the counter. What will you do? She said. I'd like to meet my sister. Eventually, if she's open to it. Helen is going to talk to her, explain. A long pause. I don't know what that conversation will look like, but I'd like it to happen. It can, she said. It will. The buyer for your building is coming on Monday. He said it differently, carefully. I heard from Lena. She was worried about you and called me, which I hope you won't be angry about. Grace looked at the offer letter she'd had on the counter for 4 days. I'm not angry, she said. What are you going to do? She looked at the shelves, the chairs, the lamp, the index cards in their yellow holders, all the handwritten recommendations, all the things that were hers. Now that had become hers through years of being the one who showed up every day, who wrote the cards, who made the coffee, who listened, who stayed. I'm not selling, she said. A pause. Grace? I know what the money would do. I know what it would solve. She looked at Thomas's letter on the wall, which she'd framed the first year, the one he'd written when they first signed the lease. He had written, "This is the beginning of everything we said we'd do. But this is not something I'm willing to trade away. And I know what I want to do with it instead." What? I'll tell you when you're back, she said. Come in. Tell me about Helen. Tell me what she looked like. What her house was like. I want to hear the whole thing. Here, he was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll be back by 6. I'll keep the light on, she said. She meant it practically. She also knew she meant it the other way. She put the phone down and looked around the store that had once been Thomas's dream and had become her own, and she thought about what it meant to inherit a life and make it yours, and what it meant to go on being careful, and what it meant to be instead awake. She picked up the offer letter. She folded it carefully in half. She put it in the drawer with all the other things she'd decided didn't require her any further attention. And she went to make the coffee. Outside, the street was full of the particular November light that makes every ordinary thing look briefly significant, and the maple tree was bare against the sky. And somewhere between here and Vermont, a man was driving back toward a decision he hadn't made yet, and she was making hers. She was not afraid. She was something better than afraid. She was ready.
หีบก็อืม
She heard the bell and looked up from the small table near the window where she'd been laying out a rough plan hand-drawn on the back of an invoice, because she'd worked this way since the earliest days when they'd planned the layout of the store on the backs of whatever paper was within reach. Boxes of books used as furniture. Knowing where you're going before the shelves are built. He looked tired. He looked lighter. Both things simultaneously, the way you look after carrying something a long distance and finally putting it down somewhere you've decided is the right place. She got up and poured the coffee she'd been keeping warm. He sat in his chair. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened the way she'd always listened, without filling silences, without narrating, without the small performances of empathy that prevent people from finishing what they need to say. She listened all the way to the end. When he was done, they sat quietly for a moment. "Her daughter's name is Sarah," he said. "She's a nurse in Providence." "You said that." "I keep saying it because I keep not entirely believing it." He looked at his hands. "I have a sister I've never met. She has a brother she doesn't know about yet, and it might become something eventually. Or it might not. But it exists. The fact of it exists." "Yes," Grace said. He looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I want to do next." "Tell me." "I don't want to go back to San Francisco. I've been renting a room at the Harwick Inn for nearly 2 months, and I've been more at rest here than I've been in 10 years. He paused. "I know that's partly the circumstances, the search, the shop, you." He said the word simply, not dramatically. "But some of it is the town itself, the scale of it, the pace. You're thinking about staying." "I'm thinking about it." He met her eyes. "I told you I wanted to wait for you to decide something. I'm still waiting. But I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, my plans aren't contingent on it." He paused. "I'm not staying because of you. I'm staying because this is where I want to be. If that complicates things, I wanted you to know it anyway." Grace looked at the hand-drawn plan on the table. "It doesn't complicate things," she said. She slid the paper toward him. He looked at it. It was rough boxes and lines, notes in her handwriting. The particular shorthand of someone who knows a space intimately and has been imagining it differently. "What is this?" he said. "The second floor," she said. "I own the whole building. I've been using the upstairs for storage for 12 years. She pointed at the drawing. "It could be a community reading room. Regular programming literacy events like Lena's, but also children's reading hours, local author readings, a monthly book discussion that's open to anyone, not just book club members." She traced a line with her finger. "I'd need to clear the storage, refinish the floors, add seating. It's not cheap." She looked up. "But it's why I'm not selling." He looked at the drawing. "This is what you want," he said. "Yes. How will you finance it?" "I have savings. I have the Whitmore estate account which Thomas set up and which I've never touched because I was always afraid touching it was the same as using him up." She looked at the drawing. "It's not. I've decided it's not. It's what it was meant for. This is what it was meant for." He was quiet, looking at the drawing. "Can I help?" he said. She looked at him. "You can give me your opinion on contractors," she said, "and on the floor plan. You have more experience organizing spaces than you've let on. She paused. But I'm not taking money from you. He held up his hands slightly. I wasn't about to offer. You were thinking about it. I was thinking about it and decided not to. A slight pause. Because you would have been right to refuse it. She nodded. He folded his hands on the table and looked at the drawing. It's good, he said. The plan. It's good. You'd need structural evaluation before you committed to the layout. Older buildings like this sometimes have surprises between the floors, but the concept is sound. He traced the same line she had. Here, you'd want 2 exits. And if you're doing children's programming, you'll need to look at the stair railing codes. He looked up. I know a contractor in the county. Good honest work. He won't oversell you. I'd appreciate the name, she said. He wrote it on the corner of the drawing. Outside, the November evening had come fully on the street, dark and quiet. One street lamp making its yellow circle in the cold. A dog walked by with its owner. A car went past. The ordinary world continuing. I told Olivia, Grace said. He looked up. About the store plan. About everything. Margaret, the search Helen, you. She picked up her coffee. I told her the real version, not the careful version. How did she take it? Better than I expected. She paused. Worse than I hoped, which is about right. She looked at the window. She's coming for Thanksgiving. Good. I told her you'd probably be around. She met his eyes. I didn't ask her how she felt about that. I told her. He looked at her for a moment. That's different from how you've done things, he said carefully. Yes. She set down her cup. I've been deciding that careful isn't the same as honest, that I've been using careful as a substitute for honest for quite a while. She kept his eyes. I don't want to do that anymore. He was quiet. Grace, he said. I'm not making a declaration, she said. I'm telling you I've thought about it. And what I think after having thought about it properly is that I like you more than is convenient, and I trust you enough to find out if there's a reason not to. She paused. That's all. A silence. That, he said, is quite a lot. It is, she agreed. Outside the street lamp, inside the lamp between the chairs. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not a speech, just a hand. She looked at it. She left hers where it was. I need to close up, she said. I know. And I have an early morning. I'll help straighten the chairs, he said. She almost smiled. They're already straight. Nonetheless, she stood and he stood, and they moved through the small closing rituals of the shop lights, check door, locked display table, straightened, and she was aware, as she'd been aware of little else all evening, of how ordinary it felt. Not electric, not cinematic, ordinary in the specific way of things that fit. She locked the front door. Outside on the sidewalk, the cold met them, and the dark and the quiet of a small town at 8 o'clock on a November evening. Good night, she said. Good night, Grace. She watched him walk in the direction of the inn, and she stood there for a moment in the cold with her keys in her hand before she turned the other way toward home. She thought Olivia is coming for Thanksgiving. She thought there is a woman in Vermont who had a daughter she raised alone and is still alive. She thought tomorrow I call the contractor. She walked home through the dark town that was hers, that she had made hers over 18 years of showing up, and she thought, this is where you are. This is what you have. This is still becoming. She turned on her porch light and went inside. Above her, the second floor of the bookstore sat waiting, full of storage that needed clearing, floors that needed finishing, a future that needed building. It would not happen quickly. It would not happen easily, but it would happen. She was certain of that now. Thanksgiving came with the particular cold clarity of a New England November, in full conviction, the sky hard and blue, and the bare trees casting their clean shadows across the sidewalk in front of the bookstore, and Olivia arrived on the Wednesday before it in a rental car from Logan, wearing a coat she'd clearly bought in Chicago and didn't have the right boots for. Grace watched her daughter navigate the sidewalk in inadequate footwear and felt the specific tenderness of mothers toward their grown children's practical miscalculations. The tenderness that exists alongside exasperation and cannot be separated from it. You need better boots, she said when Olivia reached the door. I own better boots. I forgot to pack them. Olivia hugged her. She was an inch taller than Grace and had Thomas's way of hugging thorough brief without sentiment performance. You look good, Mom. You said that like you were checking. I was checking. Olivia came inside. She looked around the shop with the familiar instinctive audit of someone who grew up in this space and notices changes the way you notice changes in a childhood home. The chairs moved. I rotated them toward the window a little more, 3 weeks ago. Olivia looked at the chairs, then at the yellow index cards, then at the display near the register, which had a hand-lettered sign for the community reading room coming next year, an invitation to sign up for the mailing list. She walked over to it. "When did you decide this?" she said. "About 3 weeks ago." Grace went behind the counter. "The upstairs is going to be cleared and refinished in January. I have a contractor. The first children's hour will be in February, probably the second Saturday." Olivia looked at the sign, then at Grace. "This is good," she said. It was simple. It was real. "This is a good idea." "I thought so. Dad would have liked it." "I know." Grace looked at the sign. "I thought so too." The dinner was at Lena's as it had been for the past several years. Lena hosted Thanksgiving with the same cheerful operational efficiency she applied to everything, and the gathering was a mix of neighbors and regulars and people who, for various reasons, didn't have somewhere else to go, which was the specific Harwick way of doing things. Daniel was there. Grace had told Olivia in advance. Olivia had been quiet about it for a day, and then had said on Wednesday evening while they were making pie in Grace's kitchen, "I'll keep an open mind." That was Olivia's version of Grace, and Grace received it as such. At Lena's, among the 8 people around the table and the noise and the food and the particular warmth of a good gathering, Daniel was what he always was present. Attentive, occasionally funny, in the dry, understated way she'd come to know. He helped with the dishes. He talked to Lena's husband Jim about a problem Jim had been having with a fence line, which was a conversation of no consequence except that Daniel listened the way he listened to everything actually, and Jim visibly appreciated it. Olivia watched this. She and Grace had a moment in the kitchen after the pie, standing at the counter with their coffee, and Olivia said carefully, "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly." More, she searched for the word. Performed. More like someone being a normal person on purpose. She turned her cup. He's actually like a normal person. Most people are actual people," Grace said. "You know what I mean?" "I do." Grace looked at the kitchen window. "He has things in him I don't know yet. There are things that will be difficult. His son and he have a long way to go. His ex-wife turned up here, which was its own thing." She paused. "But yes, he is what he appears to be, which I've tested fairly thoroughly." Olivia looked at her mother. "You're happy," she said. The same quiet, surprised tone as 2 months ago on the phone. "You sound different." Not performing happy, actually." Grace considered this. "I'm something," she said. "I'm not sure happy quite covers it. I'm awake. I feel more awake than I have in a long time." Olivia put her cup down. She looked at it. Then she said, "He should be good to you. He should understand what he's getting, which is someone who is not—" She stopped. "You're not someone who can be taken for granted." "I know. I mean it, Mom. If he—" "Olivia," Grace put her hand over her daughter's briefly. "I know. I promise you I know." She held her eyes. "I have also decided not to spend the rest of my life avoiding things because they might go wrong. Your father and I might have gone wrong, and we didn't. Things that don't go wrong are still not guaranteed." She paused. "I'd rather be awake for it." Olivia looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, slightly surprised, the way you laugh when someone has said the right thing unexpectedly. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Mom." They went back to the table. But the winter came. December brought the contractor a man named Paul Yates, who was thorough and honest and showed Grace 3 structural issues in the upstairs floor she hadn't known about, and whose fixing added 6 weeks to the timeline and a significant portion of her contingency budget, and who apologized for this with the authentic regret of someone who wishes he had different news. "It's better to know now than to find out in March," Grace said. "That's the healthy attitude," Paul said. "I'm practicing it," she said. Daniel helped move the storage boxes down to her garage, a 2-weekend project that was cold and unglamorous, and occasionally aggravating because some of the boxes were labeled in Thomas's handwriting, and she stopped twice longer than she intended looking at them. He didn't say anything when she stopped. He waited. Then they kept going. She was learning that about him, the patience. Not the performed patience of someone waiting for you to finish so they can respond, but actual patience. The willingness to let things take the time they took. She was trying to learn the same thing about herself. Christmas was quiet. Olivia called. Marcus Daniel's son called, which was unusual enough that Daniel was slightly off balance for the rest of the evening. They had a long conversation, the first without specific agenda. Marcus had found out about Helen's daughter, Sarah, and had opinions about it, tentative ones offered with the caution of someone who is still learning to have opinions out loud. And Daniel had listened, and they had not agreed on everything, and no one had hung up. "That's a good sign," Grace said. "Yes." He looked at the table between them. He said he might come for New Year's. To Harwick. He said he wanted to see what had changed his father's plans. He paused. He used the word father, not Daniel. He hasn't done that in a while. Grace looked at him. He was trying to hold the expression of a man for whom things are simply going well, and he was not entirely succeeding, and she found that in its imperfect way, it was the most genuinely moving thing she'd seen from him. "That's good news," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." Marcus came on the 29th. He was 32, dark-haired, with his father's way of moving through a room and his mother's more angular precision in conversation. He came into the bookstore on the first morning with the slightly aggressive nonchalance of someone who has decided to form his own opinion and is not going to be hurried. He spent 20 minutes looking at the shelves. Then he brought 3 books to the counter: contemporary fiction, a collection of essays, and a used copy of Evan Connell's Mrs. Bridge. And he looked at Grace with the directness of someone who has thought about this moment. "Dad says you recommended that one," he said. "It was your father's choice," she said. "I just pointed at it." He looked at the book. "He talks about you," Marcus said. He doesn't usually talk about people directly. He talks around them." He looked up. "He talks about you directly." Grace rang up the books. "He talks about you directly too," she said, "in case you wanted to know." Something relaxed in Marcus's face. Not fully, but the direction was clear. He paid for the books and thanked her and went to meet his father for the walk they'd planned, and Grace stood at the counter and thought families, the long, hard work of them, the ways they break, and the specific kind of courage it takes to put a hand on the brake and see if it holds. She thought that man drove someone to a bus station with his last spare money. She thought that's where it comes from, the capacity. She thought you can know who someone is. You can find it in the evidence of their life, the things they did when nobody was watching, the people they helped when it cost them something. You could know. She arranged a few books on the display table. She went to make the coffee. February brought the first community reading hour. 11 children came between the ages of 4 and 8, accompanied by an assortment of parents and grandparents. The upstairs room was not finished. It was still in progress, smelling of sawdust and new paint. So they used the downstairs, rearranging the shop into a configuration that Paul Yates observed was structurally inadvisable from a shelving stability standpoint, and that Grace told him was going to be fine. It was fine. She read from a picture book about a lighthouse keeper and her daughter. She had chosen it because it was good, and because it had nothing to do with her own life, and because the best stories are the ones that don't need the reader's life to make them true. Afterward, the children scattered into the shelves, the way children do, and the parents stood with their coffee and their phones, and Lena moved among them, handing out flyers for the mailing list, and Grace stood near the door and looked at her store full of people and sound and mess. She thought Thomas would have loved this. She thought, so do I. She thought I do. Daniel was near the biography section, where he always was, at the back, watching without interfering, understanding the occasion without requiring anything of it. He caught her eye across the room. She did not look away. He did not look away. Around them, 11 children discovering books, parents talking, Lena organizing Harwick, being Harwick. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of a life in motion.
Passing.
Spring was slow to come, as it always was in New England. The fall starts and the late snows the week in April, when everyone allows themselves to believe it's finally here, and then it snows again, and everyone is outraged, as if this has never happened before. The upstairs room opened in April. Paul Yates finished on a Thursday, and Grace and Daniel and Lena and Jim Voss's teenage daughter, Petra, who had been helping with the painting, carried the last furniture up the new refinished stairs and arranged the tables and chairs in the configuration Grace had been planning since November. It was a good room, wide windows, the floors pale with new finish, the shelves along one wall holding a rotating library collection, books people could borrow and return or not return, which was a policy of deliberate generosity Grace had decided on, because some of the best books she'd ever read had been the ones she'd borrowed and not returned. She stood in the middle of the room. She thought, this is what it was waiting for. She thought, this is what I was waiting for. The grand opening was on the first Saturday in May. Lena had made flyers. Paul had donated the leftover paint from someone's bathroom renovation to cover the signage costs, which was a gift that didn't make obvious sense, but that Grace accepted with genuine warmth. The Harwick Courier ran a piece, a legitimate one. Local reporter asked first photograph the shelves and not the windows. 70 people came through the door between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Grace stood at the register and greeted people and sold books and climbed the stairs a dozen times to check on the reading room where someone was always sitting and sometimes more than one person, and she thought, this is it. This is what it was supposed to be. This is the full thing. Toward the end of the afternoon, in the lull before closing, she was straightening the new arrivals table when she heard Daniel come up behind her. She knew his step. She had known it for months. 70 people, he said. Lena counted. Of course Lena counted. He stood beside her looking at the room. The poetry basket is empty. She looked. It was. She had put out 20 copies of a new anthology that morning, $40 worth of inventory, entirely certain it would sit there through the summer the way the last one had sat for 2 years. It was gone. She started to say something. She stopped. She stood there for a moment with the complicated, complete feeling of a person who has been proven exactly right about the thing they needed most to be right about. Daniel was quiet beside her. Then he said quietly, Grace. She turned. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, which was his way of not being sure of himself, which she had learned to read as clearly as she read anything. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across a room full of children and parents in February, fully without agenda, without the managed expression of someone navigating their own feelings carefully. I'm not going to make a speech, he said. Good, but I want... He stopped, started differently. I've been trying to find the right time for the last 3 months, which is probably too long. It is, she said, a little. I know. He held her eyes. I love you. I don't mean it as a declaration or a pressure. I mean it as a fact that I wanted you to have. He paused. Whatever you do with it. Grace looked at him. She thought about the day he had walked in from the rain, a stranger in a plain coat with a bag of books. She thought about the 2 chairs by the window, and the coffee going cold between them, and the particular quality of silence between people who are listening to each other. She thought about a woman on a bus in 1987, and a photograph at a centennial, and the specific grief of learning that the people we love were also people we didn't fully know. She thought about what it meant to stay. She thought about what it meant to go forward. She thought about Thomas, who had driven someone to a bus station with his last money, who had built this store with his hands, who had died at 53 and left behind a woman who had loved him, and had spent 8 years becoming herself in the absence of him, and who was standing now in her own bookstore, in her own town, in her own life, and who was no longer afraid of what came next. I know, she said. She crossed the ordinary distance between them, and she stood close to him for a moment. Just close, his hand finding hers the way it had found it months ago across a small table, and she thought, here, I love you too, she said, in case you needed to know. He looked at her. He did not make a speech. She appreciated that. That evening, after the last customer had gone and the lights were turned off in the reading room upstairs, and the books were back in their places, and the poetry basket was empty and waiting to be refilled, Grace locked the front door of the bookstore for the night. The town was quiet around her. The spring evening still held some cold. It always did this far into May, in this part of the world, and the street lamp made its circle on the sidewalk, and the maple tree had new leaves, small and sharp-edged, the specific green of early spring before it becomes the dense green of summer. Daniel was beside her. He took her hand. Not the careful first gesture of months ago, just her hand the way you hold the hand of someone you know. She looked down the street. She had walked this street 10,000 times. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every storefront, the way the light changed in all 4 seasons, and the way the town sounded at different hours and different temperatures. She knew it the way you know a place you have chosen over and over every day. She thought 8 years ago, I thought this was where I would be until the end. Not unhappily, not with regret, just quietly in the life that remained. She thought I was right about the place and wrong about the life. The right place and a life still growing. She squeezed Daniel's hand. He squeezed back. They walked. The town went on around them an evening in May in Harwick, Massachusetts. Nothing special about it except everything. The way evenings are when you are, for the first time in a long time, genuinely curious about tomorrow. She was curious about tomorrow, for the first time in a long time. She walked home with her hand in his, and the spring dark came down soft around the town, and somewhere above the bookstore, the reading room waited with its empty shelves ready for filling, and she thought, this is not the end of something. This is what it looks like when you begin.
Mas na
The meeting with Sarah happened on a Saturday in June. Daniel had been in contact with Margaret, who was Helen now, and had been for 35 years, and whom Grace thought of as both simultaneously the way you think of a person's before and after, as parts of the same whole, and the conversations had been slow and careful, and Daniel had waited, and in June, Helen called and said Sarah was ready. Grace drove with him to Providence. She almost hadn't. She had spent 2 days considering whether she ought to stay home, whether this was a thing between Daniel and his half-sister that didn't require her presence, whether she was inserting herself into something that was not hers. She had decided against that kind of careful. I'd like you there, he had said simply. If you're willing, I'm willing, she had said. They drove on a Saturday morning in his car this time, which was less battered than hers, and had a working speaker on every side, and she watched the Rhode Island landscape come up around them and thought about the word family, how it applied and where it stopped applying, and whether the border was clear or movable. Sarah's apartment was in a neighborhood near the hospital where she worked, quiet streets. Old brick buildings, window boxes full of summer geraniums. She was 37. Grace had recalculated, not 38. She had her mother's coloring and a quality of stillness that was distinct from both her parents, as Grace had come to understand them, not the chosen stillness of a man learning to be still, not the wary stillness of a woman who had survived by not drawing attention. Something different. Something that seemed to come from the inside. She met them at the door. She and Daniel looked at each other for a moment in the way that people look at each other when they are searching for the part of themselves that exists in another person's face. She was the right age to be his daughter, and she had enough of something, the jaw maybe, or the particular set of the eyes, that it was visible once you looked for it. Come in, she said. They came in. Grace sat with her coffee in Sarah's living room while Sarah and Daniel talked. She didn't direct the conversation, and she didn't fill the silences. She was there the way she'd learned to be there when things needed to happen at their own pace, present, and not intrusive, available, and not insistent. Sarah asked Daniel about the company, about his life, about his son. She asked about his mother carefully, with the wariness of someone who is trying to understand a person who has been both adversary and, in some complicated way, protector. She kept the letters, Daniel said. Your mother's letters. All of them for 30 years in a box she never got rid of. Sarah looked at the window. Why? She said. I think because she knew, he said simply. She knew about the affair. She probably knew about the pregnancy. And she was not a woman who could act on things in the ways she might have wanted to. She had a certain kind of life, and she kept to it. He paused. But she kept the letters. That was all she could do, I think. Keep them. Make sure they didn't disappear entirely. Sarah looked at her coffee cup. My mother never spoke badly of her, she said. She spoke badly of your father. She was clear about that. But she never said anything against your mother. She paused. I used to wonder about that. I think she knew the difference, Daniel said, between the person who hurt her and the person who was also hurt. A silence. Then Sarah said, I'd like to meet your son eventually, Marcus, if he's open to it. Daniel looked at her. He is, he said. I already asked. Sarah smiled, a brief, startled thing like light through a window. Grace drove them home in the afternoon because Daniel was too inside his own thoughts to drive, which she didn't say, but which she understood from the way he sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and watched the road go by without speaking for 20 miles. She let the silence be. At the Harwick town limit, he said, Thank you for being there. Of course, she said. No, I mean you held the room. Without doing anything obvious, you kept the whole thing from, he looked for the word, from becoming too much. She was calmer because you were there. Grace looked at the familiar road opening up into familiar streets. I've had practice, she said, in creating rooms where people feel like they have time. He looked at her. Yes, he said, you have. She pulled up in front of the bookstore, and they sat for a moment in the parked car, the summer afternoon around them, the town going by at its own pace. Good day, he said. Yes, she said. A good day?
Pat.
Olivia came back in July with actual winter boots, which she would not need until November, and which Grace took as a gesture. She stayed a week. She met Sarah, who had come to visit Harwick, with the tentative curiosity of someone learning a new landscape, and Grace watched her daughter and this woman, 7 years apart in age, find the particular frequency that women find when they recognize something in each other. They went for a walk. They came back talking about hospitals in Chicago and the specific loneliness of professional women in their 30s, and Grace made dinner and fed all of them and sat at the head of her table and thought this. This is the table full. I like her, Olivia said quietly in the kitchen, while Daniel and Sarah were arguing pleasantly about something in the living room. Yes, Grace said, I do too. She didn't have an easy, but no, she's done well. Olivia looked at the door. She has his jaw a little. She does. Olivia turned. Mom. Yes, I was wrong about what I said on the phone, that I was worried because he's... She stopped. I was projecting things onto it that weren't fair. You were being careful, Grace said. On my behalf. That's not wrong. It was close-minded. You're allowed to be close-minded about people you love, Grace said. You just have to be willing to revise. Olivia looked at her. He's good for you, she said. He's the kind of good that it's not fixing anything. It's not rescue. It's just... She searched. He sees you. He actually sees you. Grace looked at her daughter. This woman, 30 years old, who had Thomas's way of hugging and her own way of loving, and still sometimes called on Sundays at 9:15 with the specific carefulness of someone who wanted things to be fine and was learning how to want more than fine. Yes, Grace said. He does. She put an arm around Olivia briefly. Olivia leaned in briefly. Then they both straightened and went back to the dinner that needed finishing. Daniel's proposal was not in front of everyone. This was something Grace was grateful for afterward, and she told him so, and he looked slightly sheepish about it in a way that told her he had at some point considered the other version and discarded it. I know you well enough to know you'd have hated it, he said. I would have, she confirmed. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in September, which is the best month in New England, and the one that Grace had always loved most. The light going amber and clean the air, finding its first real edge, the leaves beginning to think about turning. She was closing the store. He was helping, which he did most evenings now. Chairs back in position, lights off shelves, straightened the small rituals of a place being properly cared for. She was writing the next day's index card, a new novel, a debut. The story of two sisters reconnecting after a long estrangement which she had stayed up too late to finish, and had consequently been slightly foggy all day when she was aware of him standing still behind her. Not straightening anything, just standing. She turned. He was holding something, not a box, just holding his hands together in the way people do when they are trying not to clench them. I've been trying to figure out what to say, he said, for about a week. She waited. I've given speeches, he said, to large rooms. I've never been nervous like this before a large room. He paused. I'm nervous now. I know, she said. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. I don't have a speech about why. I think you know why. I think we both know what this is. He held her eyes. I want to keep having mornings and evenings in the same places. I want to keep watching you be exactly who you are. I want to keep learning what I don't know yet. He paused. I want the ordinary life. With you. She looked at him. She thought about what ordinary meant. She thought about the chairs by the window and the lamp between them and the years of showing up and the particular quality of a person who actually listened. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her and had died and had left behind a life she'd had to make new, and who she thought she believed would have recognized something true in this, something that honored rather than erased. She thought, I'm not afraid. She thought, here. Yes, she said. He opened his hands. The ring was simple, a slender thing, old gold, a single stone not large. Not a statement ring, something that looked like it knew itself. She looked at it. She thought that's exactly right. She let him put it on her hand. They stood in the quiet bookstore at the end of an ordinary Tuesday with the index card still half written on the counter and the lights on low and all the shelves and their books around them, and it was nothing like the movies. It was better. It was the thing itself. Okay, she said after a moment. Okay, he said. She looked at the ring. I should finish the index card, she said. Probably. She turned back to the counter. She picked up the pen. She could feel him smiling behind her, which was a very particular thing to feel. She wrote a story about sisters who find each other again, about the things we owe each other and the things we owe ourselves and the hard work of telling the difference, about what it means to come back to someone after everything. Highly recommended. Take your time with it. She set down the pen. She looked at the ring on her hand. Olivia is going to say I should have called her first, she said. Probably, he said. I'll call her when we get home. We could call her now. No. She turned the lamp off over the display table. Now we go home. She looked at him. Together. He held the door. She walked through it. Outside, the September evening waited cool and clear and full of the specific promise of this season, which is not the reckless promise of spring, but something steadier. The promise of harvest, of things that took a long time to grow finally becoming what they were always going to become. The street was quiet. The maple was beginning to turn. Grace put her coat on and looked up at the second-floor windows of the bookstore where the reading room waited in the dark for tomorrow. She thought about the children who came on Saturday mornings, and the parents who stood with their coffee, and the books in the borrowing shelves, and the sound the room made when it was full, which was the specific sound of a place being used for what it was meant for. She thought tomorrow I'll write the next index card. She thought tomorrow I'll call Olivia. She thought tomorrow, and all the days after that. Daniel's hand found hers. They walked. The street was theirs, and the town was hers, and the evening was September in New England, which is a kind of beautiful that doesn't require anyone's permission. She was 52 years old. She was not done. She was in fact only now beginning to understand what she was capable of, and tomorrow and the day after that she would find out.